In this lecture, we'll be dealing with the philosophy of Confucius. And I'll begin by setting to rest what might strike some people as something of a mystery. Why is it, if Confucius is such a prominent Chinese thinker, that he doesn't have a Chinese name? Well, obviously he did have a Chinese name. Confucius is a kind of Latinization of Kung Fu Zi, the Honorable Master Kung. We'll continue to use the usual reference Confucius, but this isn't a name that he would have recognized. He lived in the period overlapping the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, and he seems to have had more impact, I suppose, than anyone else in East Asia. What's striking is, if you read anything about his biography, he felt as though he had really failed to be very influential. This is certainly a case where posthumously his influence has traveled a lot further than he would have ever imagined. He's known as China's first private teacher. Basically, in the course of his life, he had attempted to become influential by means of getting a government post. And he actually succeeded in getting a fairly high position by the time he was 50. But political intrigue, office politics you might say, ended up leading to his having to retire and basically leave the state where he was employed. So for the next 13 years, he was basically an itinerant teacher. He had a group of students that gathered around him. And he certainly hoped that he could get an influential government position in some other state. But this dream was very frustrated. He also viewed himself as not so much an originator as a transmitter. I think this indicates something that's actually more widespread in Chinese philosophy than simply in Confucius' way of expressing himself or in the Confucian tradition. Namely that innovation, originality, isn't necessarily viewed as a good thing. Certainly Confucius is extremely innovative, but what he focuses on is the fact that this is carrying forth what's important from the tradition. That basically he's not trying to improve on what the sage kings, the sort of legendary founders of Chinese society, had come up with, but instead he's transmitting it, carrying it forward, bringing it into a new generation. What was distinctive is Confucius' way of interpreting certain ideas that had been extant before then. The main one that I'm going to focus on is the idea of nobility. Nobility in China, as in other parts of the world, was typically viewed as something that was a function of what family you were born into. Confucius' idea was that nobility ought to be a moral concept, not a kind of socio-political one. A person's merit, not the family that they were born in, is really what's decisive in whether or not one is a noble person. The term used, junsa, is translated variously. One translation that I think gets some of the flavor of this across is the expression gentleman. We use the expression gentleman sometimes just as a kind of general way of referring to men in general, as in ladies and gentlemen. But we also use the term gentleman to refer to someone who is particularly exemplary. So-and-so is a true gentleman. There's also the feudal aspect of gentleman too, though, the idea that someone belongs to the aristocracy. And that's one of the reasons I think it's a somewhat flawed translation, but it's important to keep in mind that for Confucius, when he talks about the exemplary person, he's really using the same word that would have been used to refer to people in aristocratic positions. His suggestion was that if people learn to cultivate themselves, if people commit themselves to the way, another use of the word Tao, the way of becoming an exemplary person, then they indeed can become one. In fact, it's possible even for anyone in principle to become a sage. Now, what does he mean by cultivation? Education, first of all, is absolutely crucial. Confucius tended to focus on education in the classics. And so when he is talking to his disciples, he'll often emphasize something that occurred in the classic of poetry, for example. The classics, in his view, are a kind of bedrock that enables people, once they've mastered them to some extent or learned in them, to do a number of things. With education, first of all, one can be much more self-reliant than otherwise. But also, it allows people to have a kind of reverence for their tradition. If you look back through the classics, he views the possibility of good role models from the past becoming important. The time that Confucius is living in was a very, very disturbed time. There was a lot of social turmoil. So reverence for those great, dignified people of the past who have played a role that is really exemplary struck Confucius as a really valuable thing in learning to cultivate oneself. It gives you a certain distance from your own time and an appreciation of those in one's tradition that have really been exemplary. This also enables one to learn from history. If we have these kind of notions of what happened in the past as, in a way, models to draw from, then we might have a better sense of where we are in the present. Now, as I mentioned, in Confucius' time, the social order was not very good. In many cases, wandering warlords were trying to amass empires for themselves. And they had, in various ways, usurped the control of various small societies or small governments away from the legitimate king. Sometimes this was more or less by means of gaining influence over the king. So the king wasn't necessarily deposed, but nevertheless you had warlords who were effectively running things. And most of them weren't content with what they had, but wanted to continue to expand their domains. So Confucius is addressing at this time a real concern about where society is going. Actually, this might be a common denominator of many philosophical thinkers in lots of traditions. Socrates, too, came at a time when there were some real problems happening in Greek society. Certain things were not working as had been intended, and that's one of the things he's pointing out, that basically we need to be rational, that we've started to become irrational in certain ways. Confucius' view was we become uncivilized to a certain extent, and this is what we don't want to continue. So the civilizing message of his teaching, it really is a way of addressing this concrete reality that there is war all over the place. And as is not surprising, people had come to not trust their governments, or each other for that matter. As Confucius sees it, the role of a government is to provide for people's needs and to create social harmony. And certainly when warlords took over, that was not really high on their priority list. Most of them simply wanted power, land, control, etc. So basically, the way things were going, governments weren't able to take care of their proper business. As Confucius sees it, the government should be, and he's assuming here that we have a sort of sovereign, emperor, king, whatever. In this case, his understanding was that we need a hierarchical structure. Somebody is going to be the ruler, but the ruler's role is something like a parent who's concerned with the whole of society. And when a ruler stops being concerned with the whole of society, that ruler, in some sense, is falling away from the real role of being a ruler. We'll talk a little bit more about this, actually, in the next lecture. But in this kind of situation where you've got people taking over the role of ruler officially, in that they have the power, but not taking over the real responsibility of rulership, people were starting to distrust each other, and in general you had a pretty uncivil society. Interestingly, because Confucius does try to renovate this notion of what a true gentleman is, what a true ruler is, it's rather interesting that at the same time he urges going back to tradition. Because you might say, well, look, he's trying to challenge the way things are. At the same time, he was very much interested in returning to ritual as a kind of basic way of organizing society. The word for ritual, li, includes a lot of things that probably we don't think of in terms of rituals. Granted, in Confucius' time, there were a number of very specified rituals. Sometimes one gets a kind of account in the Analects, a book that was put together by disciples of Confucius after his death. You get descriptions of certain rituals that Confucius was very, very observant about. And you get the impression that there were all kinds of details of everyday life that Confucius thought were great that we would find very stilted. But I think it's helpful to keep in mind what our own rituals are. As Confucius saw it, li, ritual, was a means of restoring community. Herbert Fingarette, describing Confucius orientation in this regard suggests, well, let's look at one of our most common rituals, shaking hands. Suppose you go to a job interview and you shake hands with a person. What does that do? Well, first of all, it creates a kind of rapport. It suggests a respect for the other person. Now, sometimes there are real disasters in handshakes. Occasionally, you have the impression that someone really doesn't know how to shake hands very effectively. Or you get the impression they really kind of don't really like to get that close to people. This indicates something too. Basically, we use the handshake as a means of conveying who we are in relation to another person. Once again, we see this emphasis on relationship. What rituals do is provide a kind of basic vocabulary, if you will, for interacting with other people. And if you're part of a society and you've learned this basic vocabulary, you don't have to think about it all the time. It's something that just comes naturally. I think for most of us, coming into a situation like a job interview where someone extends their hand, it's not going to be any question to us what we're supposed to do. In fact, I think even reflecting on this wouldn't occur to most of us. It's just very obvious what a handshake is. And the idea is, as Confucius sees it, by doing something even that simple, you've elevated the level of interaction. You've indicated something like respect. You've done something to, in a way, beautify the situation. You've basically shown what it is that you're intending to do, namely relate to the person in a kind of straightforward, understanding, trusting way. The Analects, this work put together by disciples of Confucius, attributes to Confucius the following line: "He who does not know the rights cannot take his stand." What that means is that if you are in a society but you've kind of missed learning this vocabulary, you've really got a lot of problems. Imagine someone coming from a society where shaking hands wasn't the thing to do. People just didn't do it. Such a person would really have trouble knowing how to respond in that kind of situation. And we actually tend to feel a little bit unnerved if in a gesture of friendship like shaking hands, someone seems to be uncomfortable with it. Knowing the social vocabulary makes things run very smoothly. Not knowing it causes things to be interrupted. So in a disruptive time like the time that Confucius was living in, all the more important to maintain these kind of gestures that allow people to communicate with each other in a more subtle way and a more immediate way in some respects than words would allow. It gives people a sense of real fellow feeling when they can engage in rituals together. Another thing that Confucius points out, besides the fact that it's hard to really take your place in society if you don't know the society's rituals, is that ritual has a wonderful quality of bringing people into harmony spontaneously. Another passage from the Analects. The master said, "Govern the people by regulations, keep order among them by chastisements, and they will flee from you and lose all self-respect. Govern them by moral force, keep order among them by ritual, and they will keep their self-respect and come to you of their own accord." What he's saying here is that, of course, it is possible to get people to do what you want them to do if you have enough force at your disposal. But you certainly can't get people to cooperate by that means. In fact, oftentimes, forcing people to do something is a means of ensuring that they're not going to cooperate. So his suggestion is it's, of course, possible to control society by extreme law and order measures. Again, he's implicitly attacking some of the warlords and their techniques. You can get people to do what you want to a degree as long as you threaten them enough. But what happens anytime you're not looking? Well, they're going to try to circumvent you. In fact, it might become a long-term strategy of theirs to circumvent you because you've built in this kind of tendency to feel complete distrust. On the contrary, if the way people are organized is by means of rituals, this kind of vocabulary of social politeness, social form, people work with these rituals themselves. People learn how to do things and tailor them to their own situation. People enjoy embracing a kind of harmonious attitude toward other people because indeed there is something in us that is deeply satisfied by ritual. You might say that it confers a kind of dignity on all our everyday interactions that reminds us of something like human respect for each other and so on. Now, one of the things that becomes an issue in Chinese thought is whether this emphasis on ritual ends up being too external. The Taoists in particular, as we'll talk about later, complain that Confucius places a lot of emphasis on these external matters, observing the proper forms, knowing what the proper forms are. And they point out that not everybody who observes forms actually has a very sincere intention. Certainly, Confucius' idea was not that people should go through the forms regardless of what they're feeling. It seems more the suggestion that people direct their feelings, express their feelings in harmonious ways by means of having certain forms. At one point in the Analects, Confucius is talking about showing respect for parents. And one of the things that he claims, something that I think in translation seems rather startling, is that the important thing is the demeanor. Now, that might not seem very obvious, because I think when we think of demeanor, we think of the way people carry themselves and move. And you might say, well, it's more important to get your parents enough to eat when they're old than having the right demeanor. But what Confucius seems to be suggesting here is that it really should be something that comes from your whole being. It's certainly possible by means of demeanor to indicate when you're not tuned into a ritual. I could think of cases where people sort of feel like they need to be civil, but they aren't really feeling that way. I've been to meetings at times where people will say hello, but you know what they're really thinking is, I hope I can manage to circumvent what you're going to try to do at this meeting. The hello in that case almost comes off as a little bit insulting, because it's not really trying to convey a sense of well-being or concern for your well-being, but instead it's really just going through the motions. Demeanor, the way you move, can also indicate certain things about whether or not you're fully into what it is that you're saying or not. I think any of us would be really disturbed if we went to a wedding where we got the impression that people were just going through the motions. If the bride and groom sort of mechanically were repeating their vows and you didn't sense that there was any kind of emotion between them, I think everybody would end up leaving the wedding feeling really kind of sickened by it. And the problem there is that there's just this kind of external charade of going through the motions, not a kind of real sense of being part of a ritual. So the Confucian ideal is not to just regiment yourself into certain kinds of behaviors. I think a way of looking at this that might resonate kind of directly with Western experience might be the relationship between being a polite person and reading an etiquette book. Of course, if you're going to address a letter to the President, the Pope, the Queen of England, it's maybe useful to have an etiquette book that tells you what the appropriate form of address is, just in case these are not things that come to your mind frequently. But I think if someone sincerely tried to utilize all the rules in an etiquette book in their everyday behavior, as opposed to just responding, we'd think there is something a little bit stilted about that person. Not only stilted, but someone who's really kind of missed the point. To be polite is not really just a function of doing certain kinds of things. It's interacting in a way that is appreciative of other people. If someone sneezes and someone says Gesundheit, again, that's kind of a ritual, I think, in much of our society, or bless you. It's something that is really kind of trivial, you might think. But nevertheless, it's one of those ways in which we indicate concern for the other people, for the other person, concern for their health, even if it's almost reflex. And it's important that some of these sort of things can become habits without their losing their vitality. It is possible, of course, to say Gesundheit almost automatically, but there's still a kind of background level of concern, presumably, behind it, or at least one would hope so. And in all the kinds of rituals that we engage in, the idea of being really tuned in to interacting with other people and sincere about it is really pretty fundamental. So Confucius is criticized for being very keen on observing certain particular details, but it's the spirit of it that he fundamentally thinks has to be there. Going through the motions is not sufficient. Even doing things somewhat oddly or differently might be appropriate given the situation. What all this points to is the fact that the Confucian ethical vision is what we might call a form of ethical particularism. When we were talking about Western ethics rather briefly, particularly in connection with Kant, I suggested that in recent Western ethical thought, a lot of attention had been given to rules. So, for example, when Kant says, we can apply the categorical imperative if you're thinking about whether this is the right thing to do or not. Granted, you have to figure out how to describe what it is you're thinking of doing. But he has a technique for figuring out, yes, this is the appropriate thing to do. And what's particularly interesting about the Kantian approach is that the whole process of thinking about the categorical imperative is to try to pull yourself out of any particular relationship to other people. To sort of think, what should anybody in this situation do? What's appropriate, not appropriate necessarily in minute detail, but what is inappropriate in this situation for anybody. And there's a good reason philosophically why he does this. His view is we're always being tempted by things we want, and we want to get these things just in terms of our desires almost without regard to what it costs. And so if we can work around people to get what we want, there's always going to be a kind of tendency within us to desire to do that. So it's important mentally to remove yourself from what's particular about your situation and your agendas and just think, is this an appropriate way for anybody in this situation to act? And if you realize that it isn't, then you probably realize at that point that you're just trying to rationalize because this is going to lead to some goal you would really like to come about. The Confucian orientation, however, is really very different from this. The idea of removing yourself from your own connections with everybody would be really an anathema to the Confucian vision. The whole basis for not only social harmony, but ethical behavior generally, is that people are related. In fact, Confucius thinks it's very important how you're related to people, what's appropriate. He would think that a funeral for a parent should be a very, very elaborate thing as compared to a funeral that you might have for someone that is more distant to you, if you're the person in charge. In other words, your particular relationship to an individual in this case dictates what the appropriate behavior is. So in general, what we get in the Analects are not statements about this is what you should do. You don't get anything like the 10 Commandments of Confucianism. Why? Well, because Confucius is very, very much aware that anything that's too general is not going to give you enough information to deal with what he thinks is really important, namely harmonizing particular relationships. So what we find instead are discussions. The Analects can be translated as, in effect, revolving discussions as well, or revolving conversations. And the reports given in the Analects are really much as the kind I've read. The master said such and such. And oftentimes there's a little vignette. Sometimes he's kibitzing with his students, or one of his students, one in particular who's always rather kind of keen on his own ability to just go in there and follow the way and do the right thing. And Confucius kind of wants to slow him down and say, you're a little bit too enthusiastic sometimes and maybe you didn't get the point. You get all these very particular interactions. And the fact that Confucius says to this kind of headstrong person like, oh yes, I'm here to defend the way, well, slow down a little bit. That wouldn't be an appropriate thing to say to another kind of student. Again, we have this sense of someone whose reactions are very, very much dictated on precisely what the situation is. So we don't find extremely general rules, or really rules at all. Instead, what we get is, once again, as I was suggesting with the I Ching, certain situations where Confucius said certain things, sometimes with more or less context, and the way to figure out how to apply them is something that's left to us. This indeed is something that has a bit to do with the way he understands ritual as well. At one point in the Analects, someone points out that, or he points out that traditionally there had been a very expensive kind of cloth that was used in a certain kind of ritual, and people had recently started using one that was less expensive, and he seemed to think this was perfectly fine. It wasn't that he was absolutely a stickler for every detail, especially if there might be some good reason to substitute something that was more affordable to most people. Instead, it's really what's appropriate, what conveys this human spirit most effectively. Are our relationships being supported or nourished by our rituals or not? So I think that there is a kind of unfortunate tendency in the West at times to imagine Confucius as being someone who is kind of a stickler for rules. This is really a very wrong way to look at him. In general, he will say very straightforward things. I mean, he doesn't try to delude anyone when he thinks something is really morally abhorrent. But nevertheless, it's not with the idea of, here are the rules to live by. Instead, it's, here is a way of orienting yourself to other people. And to look back again at his context, in his time and place, where basically people were getting to be less civil to each other, he suggests that ritual is a way of becoming more civil. I think it's comparable perhaps to a debate that's sometimes waged right now about school uniforms. Some people would argue that wearing uniforms at school actually heightens the level of good behavior. Why? Because people feel like they've sort of taken on a role as a student, and they feel a little bit more like behaving as a student once they've assumed a particular garb. Now, I don't know whether there are scientific studies that can absolutely demonstrate a correlation, but I think Confucius would think this is completely as one would expect. That by assuming the garb of ritual, you've actually taken on something that becomes you. You become the role. And this is actually, I think, something very important too. Often when we use the word ritual, I think, it tends to seem something sort of psychologically detached from us. Something foreign, maybe something that you have to read a special book and memorize an incantation or something. It seems something that doesn't have to do with our everyday life. So I think it's valuable to remember Fingeret's example of shaking hands. I doubt many of us would think of that prima facie as a ritual, or standing up to sing the Star-Spangled Banner at a baseball game. Another ritual behavior that I think we don't usually think of as a ritual behavior. But nevertheless, in an important sense, it is. It's something that has to do with the way we take our place in our community, take our place among other human beings, and express our willingness to participate. So what Confucius does, rather than suggest, here are the rules to live by and you figure out how to apply them, is to really focus much more on particular virtues that lend oneself to being exemplary. The exemplary person is going to be one who is concerned about relationships among other human beings. An exemplary person is one who is able to really feel at one with the ritual. An exemplary person is not going to be someone who is really sort of feeling that they're reading something stilted when they're taking their wedding vows, for example. But instead, they become one with any ritual that they're engaged in. And it's become tailored to their actual situation. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about the particular virtues that Confucius recommends, in addition to the recommendation of Li. But all of this is, again, in response to an idea that society needs certain kinds of forms in order to really function as a society. Thank you.